The important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existence. That's Albert Einstein, and, well, it really feels right for kicking off our deep dive today. Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. We're the place where we unpack those critical insights, looking closely at the sources you need to understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Today, we're taking a really critical look at a significant current affairs topic. It's drawn from an important discussion recently published in the Indian Express.
And this is a really crucial discussion for anyone who wants to be well-informed. I'd say especially for UPSC aspirants navigating, the daily mains, current affairs, and maybe even prelims.
Definitely.
We're diving into the escalating tensions around these climate-related trade measures, specifically the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM for short.
Right, CBAM.
And the really strong opposition it's getting from major developing nations, particularly the BRICS countries.
Okay, so our mission today is pretty clear then. We're going to unpack what CBAM actually is. We want to understand why it's causing so much friction globally.
Yeah.
And explore its broader implications for international trade, for climate policy, and really importantly, for developing economies like India and China.
Exactly. There's a lot to cover there.
So, okay, let's get right into it. What exactly is this CBAM, this Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism that the EU has rolled out?
Okay, so at its heart, CBAM is basically an import duty. It's something Europe is imposing.
An import duty.
Yeah, on goods that are produced in other countries, specifically using processes that create more carbon emissions than what EU domestic manufacturers are allowed.
So it's like a border tax based on carbon footprint.
You could definitely put it that way. A carbon tax applied right at the border.
And the EU, they're framing this as a way to check something called carbon leakage. Can you break that term down for us? What does it mean, and why is it such a big deal for them?
Sure. So carbon leakage, the way the EU sees it, is basically when industries pack up and move their production.
Move where?
To countries with, let's say, less strict rules on emissions. They do this to avoid the higher environmental costs back in the EU.
Ah, okay. So they can produce cheaper elsewhere.
Exactly. And that potentially undermines the EU's own climate goals.
Yeah.
Right? If emissions just shift elsewhere instead of reducing globally.
Right. Makes sense.
So the EU's official reason for CBAM is that it's a tool to put a fair price on carbon emitted during production.
Yeah.
And also to encourage cleaner industrial production in non-EU countries.
Encourage cleaner production. Okay.
They also stress its design, they say, to comply with World Trade Organization rules.
How does that work in practice, the compliance bit?
Well, the mechanics are EU importers have to buy these things called carbon certificates. The number of certificates corresponds to the carbon price that would have been paid if those goods were made under the EU's own carbon pricing system.
Okay.
But, and this is important, if a producer outside the EU can show they've already paid some kind of carbon price in their home country for making that product, then that cost can be fully deducted for the EU importer. So it avoids double charging, in theory.
I see. And is this fully active now?
Not quite the full system. It's currently in what they call a transitional phase that started in 2023 and runs until 2025. It's mostly about reporting emissions right now.
And after 2025.
Then the definitive regime kicks in from 2026. That's when the actual payments start based on those certificates.
Okay, so on the surface, the EU says it's about leveling the playing field, pushing for cleaner production globally.
That's the pitch.
But obviously, it's not being received that way everywhere. Which brings us to the other side of the coin. If the EU says it's about climate, why are developing countries, India, China included, reacting so critically?
Right, and this is where it gets really contentious. For these nations, CBAM doesn't look like a fair climate tool. It looks like a unilateral protectionist trade barrier.
A trade barrier? How so?
Because it effectively makes their products more expensive when they try to sell them in Europe. Think about things like steel or cement coming from India. Suddenly, they face this extra carbon cost at the EU border.
Which makes them less competitive compared to EU products, or maybe products from countries with similar carbon pricing.
Exactly. And that's a huge concern for economies that rely heavily on exports, especially considering where they are in their development journey.
So what are the core objections? Are they saying it breaks specific rules?
They are, yeah. Developing countries argue pretty strongly that CBAM violates international agreements on both trade and climate fronts.
Like which ones?
Well, take the Paris Agreement from 2015. It actually has provisions meant to protect developing countries from the negative social and economic impacts of what they call response measures taken against climate change. CBAM looks like one of those measures to them.
Okay, so the Paris Agreement itself.
And also, just last December, at the big climate summit, COP8 in Dubai, world leaders put out a statement acknowledging that measures taken to combat climate change, even unilateral ones like CBAM might be seen, quote, should not constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or a disguised restriction on international trade.
That sounds pretty direct, a disguised restriction on trade.
It's strong language, yes. And developing countries feel CBAM falls into that category.
You mentioned development stage earlier. Is that also part of the objection?
Absolutely. A really crucial point they make is that CBAM seems to ignore this fundamental principle embedded in, decades of climate negotiations. The idea of differentiation.
Differentiation, meaning?
Meaning that developed nations, who have historically emitted the most and are wealthier, have different responsibilities and, frankly, different capacities than developing nations. Developing countries are still growing, still trying to lift millions out of poverty.
And CBAM applies a kind of one-size-fits-all carbon price at the border, regardless of that history or capacity.
Essentially, yes. And the practical effect, they argue, is that it can end up benefiting industries in developed countries that already meet standards similar to the EU's, while putting developing countries at a real disadvantage. It forces a pace of change that might not fit their national circumstances.
That point about differentiation feels really central. So for a country like India, is the core issue less about, say, putting a price on carbon eventually, and more about who decides that price and timeline? Is it about sovereignty over their own development path?
I think that's a huge part of it. It's about equity, fairness, and having the policy space to manage their transition based on their own needs and capabilities, consistent with the principles agreed under the UN climate framework.
You can see how it feels like an external imposition.
Exactly. From their perspective, it can feel like Europe is exporting its climate policy costs onto them without fully acknowledging the historical context or the development needs.
Okay, this naturally leads us to the diplomatic side of things. How have these developing economies, particularly groups like BRICS, but also BASIC, been pushing back collectively?
The pushback has been significant and increasingly unified. Take the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now the newer members too.
Right.
They put out a joint statement just this July 7th, from Rio de Janeiro. And the language was, well, pretty blunt.
What did it say?
They explicitly stated they condemn and reject unilateral, punitive, and discriminatory protectionist measures under the pretext of environmental concerns.
Wow, condemn and reject. That's strong.
It really is. Probably the strongest collective language used against these types of measures so far.
Have there been other actions beyond statements?
Oh, yes. There have been concrete diplomatic moves. For example, at the preparatory meetings for the next big climate conference, COP29 in Baku, China, India, and some other countries formally submitted a request to put climate-related trade measures like CBAM onto the official agenda for discussion.
And how did that go down?
Well, it actually delayed the start of the opening session by several hours because there was quite a debate.
Really?
Yes. Ultimately, it faced strong opposition, particularly from the EU, and the proposal had to be, let's say, parked for the time being. But it showed how urgently these countries want this issue addressed multilaterally.
So they're trying to force it onto the international stage for discussion.
Exactly. And you also see the BASIC group, that's India, Brazil, South Africa, and China, taking a consistently firm line. Even back at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, they put out a joint statement calling for a united solidarity response by developing countries. They warned that unilateral measures like carbon border taxes could result in market distortion and significantly aggravate the trust deficit amongst parties.
That trust deficit point is interesting. It suggests these measures could actually harm broader climate cooperation.
Precisely. If countries feel they're being unfairly targeted by trade measures disguised as climate action, it definitely doesn't help build the cooperation needed to tackle the climate crisis globally.
It really does underscore how tangled trade and climate have become and the potential for geopolitical friction.
Absolutely.
So, stepping back a bit then, is CBAM just this one-off EU policy? Or should we see it as part of a bigger picture, a larger trend where climate change is fundamentally reshaping global trade, maybe even pushing things towards more protectionism?
That's a really critical question, and I'd say CBAM is definitely not an isolated incident. is probably the most prominent example right now, but it signals a much broader trend.
Why is CBAM itself so significant in that trend?
Well, partly because the EU is such a huge market, right? It accounts for something like 15% of global imports.
Yeah.
So its rules have a massive ripple effect.
True.
And the list of goods covered by CBAM right now, iron, steel, cement, fertilizer, aluminum, electricity, is actually set to expand. That means the impact will grow.
And are other countries doing similar things?
They're certainly thinking about it. The UK and Canada, for instance, are reportedly considering their own versions of a CBAM.
Yeah.
If that happens, you could see this kind of policy spreading.
A domino effect, potentially.
Could be. And beyond CBAM itself, there are other types of non-tariff trade measures bubbling up that are linked to climate or environmental concerns.
That way.
For example, the EU also has a ban on importing products that come from illegally harvested forests. Deforestation is a major climate issue, so that's another trade tool linked to environment.
Okay.
And then you have the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA.
Right. Signed in 2022. That caused a stir, too.
It did. While it's framed as domestic policy, its huge incentives for American clean energy tech and electric vehicles definitely act as a non-tariff measure. It significantly impacts global trade patterns and competitiveness in those green industries.
So CBAM, deforestation rules, the IRA, it does sound like a pattern.
It really does. What we might be seeing is the rise of a sort of climate protectionism.
Climate protectionism.
Yeah, where environmental goals get tangled up with national economic interests, strategic goals, maybe even security concerns. It makes global cooperation much, much trickier.
And is this just about climate, or are other factors feeding into this protectionist trend?
It's definitely broader than just climate, though climate is becoming a major justification or driver. We've seen increasing protectionism for a while now, driven by straightforward economic competition, strategic rivalries, and security worries.
Like the Trump tariffs, for instance.
Exactly. Those weren't explicitly climate-related, but they tapped into fears about, say, U.S. manufacturing and dependency on other countries.
And how does China fit into this, especially with green tech?
That's a huge piece of the puzzle. China's achieved remarkable dominance in many new energy supply chains. Solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, processing critical minerals needed for the transition.
Much more dominant than OPEC ever was in oil.
Arguably, yes, in some of these specific green tech areas. Their dominance far exceeds that of oil-producing countries in the fossil fuel era for certain components. And this concentration, especially as the world transitions away from fossil fuels, fuels anxieties in the U.S. and Europe about energy security and supply chain resilience.
So the energy transition itself, paradoxically, might be feeding protectionist impulses because of who controls the new supply chains.
That's a very real dynamic playing out. It adds another layer to why we're seeing policies like CBAM and the IRA emerge now. It's climate, it's economics, it's geopolitics, all mixed together.
Wow. Okay, this has been a really thorough exploration. It's clear just how complex this interplay is, climate goals bumping up against trade rules, national interests clashing with global equity principles. CBAM really is a perfect case study.
It truly is.
And understanding these kinds of multifaceted issues, it's just essential if you want to be genuinely well-informed about the world today.
Absolutely. And maybe if we connect this back to the bigger picture, it leaves us with a pretty significant question to ponder.
What's that?
As the whole world is grappling with the urgency of climate change, how do nations actually balance these environmental imperatives with long-standing principles of fair trade, of equitable development? And what does this tension mean for the future of global cooperation, not just on climate, but across the board?
It really is a crucial question for our times. So we really hope this deep dive has helped give you, our listeners, a clearer understanding of this critical and evolving issue.
Hope so.
If you found this discussion valuable, maybe for your UPSC preparation or just for staying informed on major global shifts, please do give this deep dive a like.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And subscribe for more in-depth analyses like this one, and definitely share your comments below. Any further questions you have or insights you want to share, we'd love to hear them.
Please do.